the OPSEC of Satoshi was fundamental. So it's not just a meme. It was actually necessary probably to bootstrap Bitcoin. So he had to do that way. But it also makes for a great story. An unprecedented story.
That was Max Hillebrand, today's guest. We've been trying to get together on the podcast for quite a while, but it just hasn't worked out until now. So I've been very excited. Max is an entrepreneur. He is an open source advocate and host of the YouTube show Bitcoin to the Max on the World Crypto Network. And his take on ownership in Bitcoin was one of the more revelatory things that I've learned over 2019, and the fact that you really don't own your Bitcoin in a more general sense. And it really just kind of blew my mind until I started to think about it more. And I think you guys are really going to enjoy this episode and are really going to take a lot away from his explanation of why you can't own Bitcoin and why I agree with him on that point. Giacomo, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me back. I'm very happy to be here.
And before we actually start, I wanted to thank you for coming back on the show. You're actually the very first interview that I ever did back on episode 9. And I appreciate your patience with me during that episode, because we actually had a power outage at my house probably towards the last quarter of it. And you waited for quite a while for me to get a cell connection going and everything like that. So I just wanted to throw that out there and say thank you for that and for coming back on.
Sure, it was fun. Yeah, now I remember it was a lot of adventure back then.
Yeah, but and we just started 2020, and Bitcoin's hitting its basically, well, I mean today the 11th anniversary of the Genesis block, and by the time this episode goes live on the 13th, we'll hit the 11th anniversary as well of the first transaction between Satoshi and Hal Finney. And I kind of had two-ish, I guess, kind of it's a bunch of questions rolled into one for this first one to lead us off with. But how do you feel about the current state of Bitcoin now? And looking back, what have we done right and what have we done wrong?
That's a very, very wide question. So I have to say I feel way better than I felt 2-3 years ago. Not sure I feel significantly better than I felt during our first interview, because I don't see, I think that most fundamental changes, fundamental confirmations and fundamental challenges in Bitcoin probably have been like the New York agreement attack and something like that. This last year I've been kind of quiet. I mean, if you look at the developments, you can see the OPTEC mailing list year review, a lot of stuff going on in Bitcoin from a technology point of view. There is a very good James Ollop 2019 year review, which is more like economical, financial, and social, like research interest and volume of transaction and so far. And if you look at that, you can see that it was a very good year with very not a lot of drama. But a lot of fundamental things that will build up for the future. There was the first Lightning Network conference in Berlin. That was great. There was a very, very bad bug in Lightning, which was also very good in order for people to understand, appreciate more, and acknowledge more the importance of specification or standard specification. So it was a good year for Bitcoin, but it didn't change my overall positivity or negativity. I think that the main threats are still basically the same. We will just see them maybe in a more sophisticated or powerful version, but are still the same attack vectors, the same threats, and the fundamental optimistic optimism generating things are still the same, if not even more. I think that maybe we will talk during our discussion a little bit of something, but I guess that now we are getting closer to the debate about privacy and fungibility and traceability, as opposed to the pretty empty scalability, so-called scalability debate of the past years. So that's getting even more serious, I would say. There is even more at stake here about privacy and fungibility than before. But I don't see surprises. Everything is slightly better. There is more stuff going on the second layer. There is very good stuff going on the first layer, like Taproot and Schnorr, and that's the kind of things that I'm trying to follow a little bit. And there is basically more competition in the ASICs production industry, which is good. There is a lot of infrastructure going on. The overall mood is not very exuberant, not very enthusiastic, which is good for me. It's very, very good, because with exuberant enthusiasm also comes hype and baseless expectations and stuff like that. That as a consultant and as a teacher, as somebody who's very interested in having a consistent narrative and not just random hype floating around, I'm kind of happy with this. So it was a good year. I'm still basically very optimistic about Bitcoin. I still think that Bitcoin can fail in very, very particular, very, very unlikely scenarios, and these scenarios are getting less and less likely every day, basically.
And let's explore that a little bit. When you're talking about the privacy debate being a little bit or more important than the scalability debate that was basically kind of figured out 2 years ago. When now there's camps. If you want to go this way, you can go there. If you want to go even to even insane levels and also enjoy a nice little cult of personality, you can go to BSV. And with the privacy debate, you said that it's more important, and the debates are starting. Could you maybe flesh out the different camps of opinions where Bitcoin's future in privacy should go?
Yeah, sure. It's not a two-sided debate. It's not like two camps, which is also usually an indicator of a more honest and nuanced debate. I mean, usually when you have two parties, not always, it's not a rule, but it's a good heuristic that when you have oversimplification of two camps, you either have one of the camps just making up the debate unilaterally, like I think was the case for the so-called scaling debate, or both camps just being ideological and not really logical. In this case, there are many different camps, I would say. So there are some people that think. Let me try to oversimplify. Let's say field one of the debate is people who think that Bitcoin should not be fundamentally fungible or private, because Bitcoin must be especially accepted by the traditional finance. It should be like yes, digital gold, but it should be like digital gold back in the gold standard era, well, where gold was not something subversive, something persecuted, something censored. It was just something natural for the financial system of the world, including governments and banks, and for a while even central banks. So Bitcoin is digital gold. Everybody will go along with it. So we must be compliant and regulated, and anything which is like privacy oriented or fungibility oriented is kind of like disturbing this work of legitimization. Like, we worked so hard to make Bitcoin apparently harmless and nice and positive, and now you want to ruin this with this narrative of privacy and possibly shady things happening. So this is one side. Like, we don't want Bitcoin to be private. The second will be the one in which, yes, we do want Bitcoin to be private. And in order to do that, we have to fundamentally change Bitcoin at every cost, completely following this specific mantra. Like, for example, many people think that you get some comments, especially from non-technical people, like, why don't you just add Fungibit to Bitcoin? Like, Fungibit is just like a single flag that you can put in the software and it will just change. And if you're not doing that, that means that you are in the first camp. That means that you don't want fungibility. So I think that this flag, this oversimplified myth, is usually associated with confidential transactions, which as in per se they have not much to do with fungibility. They're mostly about amount obfuscation, and then there are basically a lot of people thinking that this is fungibility. If you do like a confidential transaction soft fork, or sorry, hard fork, then everything is fine. If you don't, then Bitcoin is doomed. So they fight, rightfully so, in my opinion. They fight the first camp because they realize that the first camp is just a delusion. You cannot have digital gold because the reason you cannot have digital gold are the same reasons you could not have any more physical gold, the same reasons for which basically central banks, they just they destroyed and they abandoned gold standard because they wanted to inflate more, they wanted to manipulate interest rates, and now they cannot go back just easily because now the government debts will be unsustainable without monetary policies, and negative interest rates, they will be unsustainable, and the economic bubble, the continued economic bubble of the modern economy will be unsustainable without negative interest rates, soon coming to US dollar as well. So it will be just unsustainable for them. So not only they cannot just get back to the gold standard, they cannot even stop accelerating the direction of fiat money. And same goes for financial privacy. They cannot just stop building an Orwellian panopticon. They are doing that because they need it. Because if you can just withdraw cash when you want and use it, nobody's going to tolerate negative interest rates in the banks. You have to be forced to stay in the banking system by censoring everything else. So the reasons we don't have digital gold are the reasons we didn't have e-gold after 10 years or something of run. E-gold was shut down just before Bitcoin was created because governments couldn't, especially the United States government and all the para-governmental structures like Federal Reserve or whatever. You can also think about NSA and basically global surveillance and terrorism or bad people, drug on war, war on drugs, sorry, etc., etc. So you cannot have digital gold because you could not have physical gold, and censoring digital gold when it's centralized is even easier than censoring physical gold. So many people say Bitcoin is cool because it's a finite supply, but I mean a well done e-gold with gold vaults which are fairly reviewed by independent parties will also be basically finished supply, which is a supply of gold, with the advantage of having the price already figured out by the market since thousands of years. So it will be more stable. Immediately it will have a great Lindy effect. So digital gold centralized with real gold backing it up will be more effective than this strange proof of work stuff with strange inflation schedule and reduction and automatic difficulty adjustment of proof of work and electricity and ASICs and so on. So the reason we cannot have digital gold is that digital gold has been censored. So now we can have it only in a decentralized way, which is Bitcoin. But the reason it is decentralized is that it's avoiding censorship. So there is no point of hoping that Bitcoin can just behave, be nice, and then it will just be regulated and it will just be accepted and compliant. Bitcoin will be legally disruptive, and it will be at different degrees in different times and in different places of the world. It will be fighted, and it will be like e-gold was and like gold was with the act confiscation of gold in the US and recently in India and so forth. So I think that the first field is misguided. But the second field we recognize as this, which is you cannot have digital gold, hard money, if it's not also dark money. You can only have hard money if it's also dark money, because otherwise you will be censored from using dark money and hard money directly. The second field just has a myth, is just following a myth about fungibility just being something you can easily add and just a choice and everything is fine. It's not. Especially in a global consensus system like Bitcoin, it's a very, very difficult process to build over many features, and any feature has a lot of trade-offs. Like a typical reaction from there was a debate recently, like Binance decided to freeze an account. Actually, it was like Binance Singapore, I think, or something like that. An account was frozen by Binance because the user withdrawed his bitcoins, and then after a few movements, so not immediately, he moved the bitcoins on a Wasabi wallet, which is a wallet doing coin join. And so Wasabi, so basically, Binance Singapore wrote to this guy, we are freezing your account with your money because you did something with the money you withdrew from us after you withdrew it from us eventually, and we cannot tolerate this. And in order to release your account, you have to promise not to do these things, not even in the future after you withdrawal. So we are checking the blockchain, and if we see in the blockchain that the money is going there after even several hopes, which is crazy because several hopes just mean that I could have spent this to other people, and these other people could have spent it to this kind of site, so not me. So they cannot really know it's me. They have an heuristic, they have a probability, but they cannot have certainty that it's me. So based on just a probabilistic heuristics, they are going to freeze my money if I engage with something they cannot tolerate. And I quote, they cannot tolerate P2P, so peer-to-peer stuff. So you cannot do any peer-to-peer stuff with your Bitcoin, which is crazy because, I mean, Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer system. It's created in order to be. There is no other reason to have Bitcoin other than having a peer-to-peer cash system. And then you cannot do gambling, which is also very ironical coming from Binance because it's basically a shitcoin casino. So, I mean, the reason people has Bitcoin on Binance in the first place is in order to do shitcoin gambling, and they cannot condone or tolerate you moving Bitcoin to gambling. And then there is also like stuff like mixers, which is crazy because, I mean, coin joins is just a regular best practice in Bitcoin in order to use Bitcoin better. It's just like telling people that if you are using HTTPS over HTTP, so you are using the security and privacy best practices on the internet, then, or if you are using like an AD blocker or a geolocation blocker on your browser because of privacy, then I cannot tolerate that and I have to freeze your money. I mean, this is just a normal bank. If people think that this could, I mean, there is literally no meaning at all, no usefulness at all in a Bitcoin that to follow these kind of rules. Not just in order to withdrawal, but even after you withdrawal, you have to be sure that nobody in the future that you will move your Bitcoin to will eventually do anything of this, which basically includes peer-to-peer or gambling, which are respectively the reason for existence of Bitcoin, the reason for existence for Binance in the first place. So there is this crazy debate, and when we suggest to use CoinJoin as the best practice, CoinJoin is just a right, reasonable way in order to it's like not reusing addresses. It's a good way to use Bitcoin. And some people, including very paradoxically the Bitcoin Twitter handler that was promoting Scamcoin a few time ago, then somebody probably in the Bitcoin field bought it from Roger Ver and now is not promoting Scamcoins anymore, but is basically promoting this notion that like CoinJoin is bad because if you CoinJoin, then your risk rate in the exchange will increase, which is like saying, I mean, just don't use Bitcoin at all. If you want to use anything, just use Fast SEPA, use PayPal, just use Revolut or whatever, or traditional banking, because the rules are even worse. I mean, in traditional banking, maybe you have some trouble withdrawing your money in cash. Not always. Like in Switzerland, I don't have any trouble, but I know that when I was in Italy, I had a lot of troubles withdrawing my own cash. But when I did, when I withdrawn my cash, they could not ask me to I mean, they didn't not follow the numbers, the matrix number of the banknotes, trying to track me and track everybody who I gave the money to in the future, in order to punish me if somebody who gets my money eventually is doing something that they don't like. This is not bank level. This is even worse than bank level. So it's completely nonsense. So yeah, my answer as always is too long, so I will try to cut it down. But I want to just give you very quickly the last camps, which are basically people who are aware that there is not a magical solution. There are very, very complex trade-off, and they think that this trade-off should be made at the expenses of other things. Like, for example, you should do like ring signatures like Monero, or confidential transactions like Monero, which makes scalability and verifiability on your full node way worse, because every signature is heavier and slower and bigger. So it's basically goes against scalability, and also again it goes a little bit against reliability of the money supply, because if there is an inflation bug in Bitcoin, everybody can notice that immediately. If there is an inflation bug in something where amounts are obfuscated, either because of mathematical problem like quantum nightmares, which are very, very unlikely, but more likely if there are implementation problems in the way people implemented this kind of math, which is a different thing from having problems in the math, then nobody can know if the inflation is happening or where it is happening. So that opens a very, very huge attack vector. So in this camp, you have people that recognizes that it's not just, please, let's just fork fungibility in, but they know about the trade-offs, and they are willing to risk auditability of the money supply, or for example, scalability in favor of these like ring signatures or confidential transaction. Other people are more conservative, and I think I side more with this last. I mean, I am really against the first kind of camp. I think that's a complete misconception to think that Bitcoin can behave. I mean, I think that some kind of Bitcoin quote unquote users will be completely regulated, but they will not even need Bitcoin in a strict sense at all. They will just use Bitcoin-based ETFs in a normal bank. I mean, if you are a Swiss investor and you just want to expose yourself to Bitcoin price volatility, that's completely legit. That's even good for Bitcoin, and that will probably be legal in many states for a lot of time. But you don't really need to buy Bitcoin. Just buy Bitcoin flavored risk on some centralized banks. Leave Bitcoin for people that want to use Bitcoin as a censorship resistant system, and use your banking regulated system in order to just bet and gamble about the Bitcoin price, which is completely legit and good. So I think that if next year we will have, I think that there are basically, and then I stop, two major good news that we could have in 2020. One will be basically Schnorr signature aggregation, which is something that cross-input signature aggregation, it will be very, very slow because it's very, very dangerous. But if you do that, not only CoinJoin becomes a good practice, it also becomes necessary for saving money. So basically, signature aggregation is a thing in which everybody who CoinJoin can just take their signature, add it up to other signatures, and they can just publish on the blockchain one single signature, saving all the space of the signatures, which is a lot of space. So basically, there is an economic incentive to do very, very big coin join among a lot of people, which is very good. And on the other side of the spectrum, I hope it will come up some regulated like US Bitcoin ETF, so that people that see Bitcoin like the first camp I was talking about, people who sees Bitcoin just as a speculative asset, which is legit, which is okay, they will just use synthetic Bitcoin to speculate, and they will leave real Bitcoin to people that knows that we have to do best practices like not reusing addresses and coin joining every time and using Lightning Network a lot. Like in Lightning Network, you cannot follow transactions, so that's good. It's also, yeah, I know I promised to finish. Just let me the last sentence
No
is also
problem.
very is also very ironic that people answer to this post with things like let's just use Monero. I mean, this is so contradictory logically speaking. The government will stop you from using Bitcoin, and maybe after many hopes, having it conjoined, maybe because they cannot even be sure it's you. But magically, the same governments and the same regulators will leave you just withdrawing Monero with CT and ring signature without any kind of censorship. That just I mean, I know the regulators are usually the stupidest part of society. That's true for a reason of public choice selection, but they're not so stupid. I mean, they're still very good in what they do, which is basically taking people's money. So that's a very stupid kind of answer. Just use a completely anonymous coin. They will just ban the anonymous coin altogether when it will become relevant and big enough. Okay, I have finished.
It's as far as in your what you were just talking about, as far as for within the privacy debate and within Bitcoin and government actions as a reason or not a reason to go down a specific road. One of the things I'd been thinking about was, if you think back to like the Libra hearings and everything like that. It was surprising actually that Bitcoin was brought up by several congressmen as kind of this not gold standard, no pun intended, of kind of digital currency, but it seemed to be used that way, as in, well, Bitcoin doesn't have centralized leaders and all this kind of stuff. It was actually strange to hear them speaking somewhat positively, and I think some of that has to do with the fact that they feel comfortable enough that given its current state, it's an open ledger and everything like that, and every single transaction can be tracked. And they've had a lot of success in tracking down certain amounts of individuals using the blockchain on Bitcoin to find out where money's moving, drug dealers or whatever. And I think that they've, at least in the little bit that they understand, think that they can find every tax cheat and drug dealer, because it is an open ledger that you can validate and peruse at your convenience. But like you were talking about with the increased privacy that in whatever implementation that we go with, you have coin joins, Lightning offers increased privacy as well. Or even, I don't know if this is actually on the table, the confidential transactions that have been talked about as a possibility for years and years and years. But the scenario that I've been thinking about lately was that, with institutional buy-in on this, whether it's Bitcoin ETFs or, a back style thing or whatever it is, right? There's going to be a lot more money that comes in at some point. And with privacy upgrades, I do think that governments, even ones that have been tolerant of it so far, will have a reaction to this. And my thought on one of the scenarios that could play out is that they will basically tell institutional actors, people that they can't control, because they can't control, individual users on the network, but they can go after institutional actors, whether they are exchanges, whether they are custodial solutions, whether they are people that are accepting Bitcoin as payments or whatever, right? Fill in the blank. And tell them basically that they aren't allowed to run the upcoming BIP that puts these privacy implementations into effect, or maybe that they need to roll back and run a version of Bitcoin that if this gets passed and then they figure it out, that they need to roll back or basically fork it off and run a different version. And that would basically put all the cypherpunks, the libertarians, the maximalists, and they overlap in quite a few ways, but into one camp running the newer implementation of Bitcoin, and then institutional actors running the older one. Likely the ticker symbol would go with the institutions that are running it. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the realistic possibility of that scenario, and what is there anything that we could do about that, or what would you see the future of Bitcoin after that?
Yeah, so first of all, I don't think that the reason politicians so far, especially in the US, which are like the brands of politicians that most of the people, including myself, are following from abroad, are seeing like kind of friendly so far with Bitcoin just because they think it's completely traceable. That's true, and I will try to analyze that. But it's also because it's still very small compared to real economic monetary dynamics. Bitcoin is still irrelevant. And so politicians can afford to be indifferent or even friendly towards something which is irrelevant. Nobody had an issue with e-gold in 1995. Everybody had an issue with, not even people in the Congress had an issue with e-gold in 2005, but people inside the Federal Reserve and the monetary financial regulation institution, they had a lot of issues with e-gold in 2005 when it was big enough to be scary. Bitcoin is not big enough to be scary, and I think it will not be for at least a couple of other market hypes. I mean, yeah, some people is getting rich, some dark net shops can use it to pay for drugs or Bibles when Bibles are forbidden. Like you know that in the Silk Road, the most purchased item was not marijuana; it was actually books. Books that were forbidden in some countries. So yes, people will use it to buy books when the government forbids books, or to buy substances like alcohol or marijuana where it's forbidden. But mostly they will use it for to store wealth. And if they use it to store wealth against inflation or against confiscation, until that becomes peak, the government will not really be triggered. And when it will be triggered, not it will not be just initially the politicians. Like the politicians are like the show business side of government, the side that they have to account. I mean, they have to talk with people to get votes. So some of them will get vote by being ferociously anti-Bitcoin, and some of that will get votes by being apparently pro-Bitcoin. It's natural. Every politician will find a niche, and some politician will be pro-Bitcoin. But the actual government machine, which is not just a political Congress machine, is even just a bureaucratic surveillance machine from NSA to financial regulators and the monetary machine of the Fed and the other analogs around the world. They will probably start to strike when Bitcoin gets big enough to threaten monetary policies and tax policies. I mean, the politicians like to talk about terrorism and Patriot Act for terrorism or immigrants, and so we have to build a wall for immigrants, but they don't really care. I mean, individually maybe they care, but the machine of the government, the government body as a whole, as a system, doesn't really care until there is money, the revenue threatened. So as long as you can tax people, if you can tax people effectively and you are not losing a lot of money in taxation, and if you can basically inflate money and manipulate interest rates effectively, you don't care. So this kind of kind of this kind of reaction, I think it will come mostly from bureaucrats before politicians, and it will come when Bitcoin will be big enough. Sure, some politicians and bureaucrats are reassured because they think that Bitcoin so far is entirely traceable, which is kind of a lie. I mean, inside the transaction, every Satoshi is actually completely fungible. You know how many inputs, you know how many outputs, but you don't know which kind of money went from which input to which output. That's technologically impossible to know. So Bitcoin is already kind of fungible at the Satoshi intra-transaction level. The problem is that you have very good. I mean, the problem is that people didn't use Bitcoin properly for a very long time. Like people started to reuse addresses because it was comfortable, it was easy, and there was not enough education. People didn't use CoinJoin because so far there are no economic incentives to do it. There will come with the Schnorr cross input aggregation, but they are not so far. So people just didn't care enough. So Bitcoin was apparently a little bit traceable if you do on-chain transactions, so not on Lightning, and if you do a lot of mistakes like reusing addresses, and if you link your KYC identity with your on-chain operations. So a lot of ifs. And the point is that there was a narrative. I mean, you can track something, not a lot of things actually. Nobody still caught like the Bitfinex hackers. Nobody. I mean, most of the major hacks, nobody got the people who did it. If you do your if you do your work well, you can get away with Bitcoin because Bitcoin is not fundamentally traceable. But there was this narrative, and I would have to say that many Bitcoiners, including me, including I mean me, I'm irrelevant in globally, but I did some lobbying in Italy and then in Switzerland, and for a while I supported this fake narrative of Bitcoin being completely traceable because it was convenient. I think that most people, I mean, some people in the first camp that think that like we are like against CoinJoin, like the guy using the Bitcoin handle on Twitter, they think that they agree with me fundamentally, maybe some of them, but they think that as a narrative is convenient to just not kick the wasp nest yet, and to make the government believe it's completely traceable. But I think this was a very short term, short-sighted move because it created two problems. The first problem is that people who are not very educated and not very people that are a little bit illiterate from a technological point of view, they understood this fake narrative and they said, well, okay, Bitcoin is completely traceable, so if I want to use some money cash like with privacy, I will have to use this new privacy scam coin like, I don't know, Dash, Zcash. And then they get hurt because not only they could get hurt financially, because then basically their money will just eventually go to zero, or to very, very low fractions of their wealth, because scam coins are scam coins and their life cycle is always pretty limited. But also they will get hurt from the privacy point of view, because, for example, people will learn that Zcash is really private, then they will use Zcash as default. Zcash shielded transactions are super heavy, so typical transactions. I mean, if you look at the transaction in Zcash, almost every user is doing T transaction that are just normal unshielded transaction, so even less private than Bitcoin because you have less liquidity and less anonymity set. And the few people who are actually using the shielded transactions, they are even more easy to track because there is super little anonymity set there. If nobody's using those transactions, even if those transactions are zero knowledge about origin and about amount, still nobody's using them, so your anonymity set is super shallow, so you are easier to track than people using the T transaction. So many people, that's just not accounting for the fact that there are some reasons to believe that Zcash itself could be actually backdoored and in the trusted setup. And I mean, there are a lot of reasons. And I just use Zcash as an example here. Many people took seriously the narrative of super trackable Bitcoin, and now they just think that that basically they will get better privacy using the last zero liquidity, zero anonymity set scam coin that will wreck them financially and privacy wise as well. And the second problem was that we convinced regulators that this is true. And so now regulators said, I mean, Bitcoin is like gold. It was intended to be like gold. So, of course, regulated banks, you can store gold in regulated banks. In Switzerland, probably you can store gold and take your gold and nobody will ask questions because Switzerland used to be a civilized place. But in other countries, you can store gold, you will do KYC AML, they will give gold to you, you will have to fill out of papers, but then the regulators don't have the absurd notion that there will be some kind of magical thing in gold that will make them able to track future spending of gold, because that's not the case. With Bitcoin, that's not the case as well. Even without Schnorr, without Lightning Network, without CoinJoin, without confidential transaction, even without all this stuff, you cannot know if I withdraw Bitcoin from your exchange and I move it on chain, you don't know if and then the address receiving that will move it again let alone the fact that there is not in Bitcoin, it doesn't exist a from address. So it's not even technically correct to say that that address will move the coin again. But let's simplify. Let's say that this address will move Bitcoin again on a coin join. You cannot even know that it's me coin joining or it's just some other guys. And it's crazy that I have to prove you. So what happened is that this delusion made the regulator asking, it convinced the regulator to ask to exchanges to apply some kind of totalitarian, crazily invasive Orwellian measures that were even unthinkable. Think about gold and cash. Of course, the use of gold and cash is restricted in authoritarian states or authoritarian leaning states, which sometimes that's just like the US or Europe. I'm not just talking about some strange dictatorship. It's restricted, but it's not restricted in a sense that they think they can actually look at the transaction somewhere and make you guilty of that, even if they don't know with certainty if it's you. So they created this fake sense of total traceability that is now creating two problems. The first problem is that some people is getting in trouble, into legal trouble, for things that are not technically provable. Some people are getting into trouble for things that are just heuristically, probabilistically possible, but we don't know if they passed this Bitcoin to somebody else or not. And the second is that exchanges, they want to keep their business open, and so now they are doubling down on this narrative because they are saying, look, regulator, we don't want you to close me down because we know that you may probably will not like Bitcoin if it works, so I'm scared that you will close me down. So now I will tell you that this narrative is true, and it's so true that I can trace and track people better than your banking system, which is completely fake, but it's something that exchanges are basically convincing the government of. The exchanges are becoming a powerful lobby trying to convince regulators that Bitcoin is not digital cash, but it's some kind of traceable public digital public registry, which is totally not. So, to get back to the final point of your question, what if exchanges will basically force you to use a whitelisted Bitcoin, basically a completely traced Bitcoin? That's a possibility. You just make. There was a project called Vulcan project a few years ago. It was like PwC with a Netkey with some other guys. They created in Australia a version of Bitcoin with multi-sig and like 2 of 2, and the second key will sign your transaction only if you give the KYC of the other guy receiving in a whitelist. So you get the Bitcoin that you cannot move if the guy that you want to pay is not registered. So even without downgrading your Bitcoin to pre-Schnorr, you can still whitelist Bitcoin. But the point is that whitelisting Bitcoin, even if it's more nuanced, it's more complex, but deep down, it boils down to the same thing as banning Bitcoin. There is no difference. You say, you just have a fork. You have privacy Bitcoin and regulated Bitcoin, but then regulated Bitcoin is basically having the same kind of problems of fiat, so it will be as useful as fiat on top of PayPal. Same restrictions, if not even worse, because in PayPal you have actually less restriction than in KYC exchanges. And then when they want to preserve monetary policy, they can just with the same effectiveness that they use to force you to downgrade the privacy, they will just ask you and force you to downgrade the auditability of the supply or to accept inflation in the supply. If they can force you to run software without Schnorr, they can force many people, but then they will also be able to force to run a software that changes the supply. So you don't only lose the privacy side of Bitcoin, but also the monetary side of Bitcoin. And when you lose that as well, Bitcoin, this kind of well-listed Bitcoin is nothing, literally. Maybe it can keep some collectible value for irrationality of the market for a while. But do you think that the market, after a few years of moving a coin, which is as easy to censor and confiscate as fiat, and as easy to inflate and manipulate as fiat, it will get any kind of value different from any other fiat money. Sure, maybe there will be a trading opportunity because the monetary policy in this new fake whitelisted Bitcoin will be different. So you can trade US dollar with this stuff, and you can hope to make money because maybe their monetary policy will be better for a while and then worse for a while, and you can trade there, you can arbitrage. But after, at equilibrium, after you do your arbitrage, this kind of money is just fiat money. It's just the same as any other money. So the real Bitcoin, regardless of the ticker, even if it takes even if it takes a lot to build again a lot of financial infrastructure, a lot of exchanges, a lot of sure, maybe they can set us back for of many years, but it's completely useless. Eventually, the whitelisted Bitcoin is going to zero because it's just fiat.
To, I guess, to jump into a completely different topic, but still a bit fringe as well. I had a discussion with Chris Derose a while back about leadership in Bitcoin, which I thought was a very interesting topic because commonly the meme is that there's no leaders in Bitcoin, and to an extent that's true. The consensus mechanism, the network, has no central coordinator. Something like IOTA does. It doesn't have this majority hash duopoly cult like in BSV. So I agree there's no central singular leader like in those examples or in the political authoritarian sense. But I do agree that there are leaders within Bitcoin. So do you agree with this view, or do you feel like as though there aren't any actual leaders within Bitcoin, not the actual network, but just Bitcoin in the big tent sort of way?
I would agree with the nuance that there are actually some kind of trust mechanism and leadership mechanism, but not in a way which is significant, and in a way that which is actually just a truism. I mean, I think that the argument of Chris DeRose is completely dishonest. I have my theory for why Chris is saying that. I think it's something more connected with his own visibility as a naysayer and as contrarian than with actual honest consideration. But the point is that any kind of argument of that kind, you can make the same argument about anything, including gold. So yes, you can run your own node, but most people, they don't know how to compile from source. So most people are just trusting some kind of signed binary from some developers. Sure, okay, you can verify gold with some kind of hydrostatic scale or some kind of electronic gold verifier. But since most people are not physicians, physicists, or chemists, or basically experts, they probably cannot even assess if the scale, if the hydrostatic scale. I mean, most people cannot build a hydrostatic scale for gold. So yes, you are trusting the guy selling you the hydrostatic scale. So gold is not leaderless because somebody is probably the market leader of the scales used to measure it, and so on. You can do that for literally everything. I mean, sure, you cannot. I mean, TCP/IP protocol is fairly leaderless, meaning that there is not a single government body that can change it at will easily. But still, somebody took some decision, and somebody may take some decision in the future. And when you are installing a browser, you are trusting Mozilla Foundation, and you are trusting Google with Chrome, and you are trusting Apple with Safari. And so if everybody colludes in order to show you something which is not a TCP/IP in your browser, then they can get away with it with most people. Some people will understand it, and some people will scream out that there was basically a fraud, but some people will not understand. So that's literally true for everything. The trust, I mean, it is true that Bitcoin is not completely leaderless and trustless, but it is true only in the very uncharitable meaning of trustless and leaderless. I mean, if you use the strawman, the trustless and leaderless literally mean that the trust system is completely cancelled from the face of the earth for everybody, including the less literate people, Of course, nothing, literally nothing, is trustless. Of course, it's a matter of degree. So what we have now is a progression from a complete government-run banking system with fiat money, with supply defined by a political body, the central bank committee, and with censorship defined by banks, which are mostly controlled by governments, in a legal cartel of the banking system, which is very close to the government and has to follow the government. It's super easy to censor, to corrupt, to buy, and to regulate. And you're switching from that to, again, to e-gold, where one guy can actually fake the supply of gold, but then you can do some audit or something. And sure, this guy can also steal money, but then he has very low market incentives to do that. And then you're moving to Bitcoin, where basically the degree of trustlessness and the degree of leaderlessness is orders of magnitude more than any other kind of financial system or monetary system of the recent history, starting from fiat. Of course, gold is even more leaderless than Bitcoin. Of course, Bitcoin in 2020 is more leaderless than Bitcoin in 2009, where Satoshi Nakamoto was the de facto absolute centralized leader. Of course, Bitcoin in 2030, if it survives, and I hope it will be more leaderless and more trustless in this sense than Bitcoin now, because the more the protocol will ossify, the more you will have to rely on developers only for upper layers modification or tech or tools. Like nobody really is relying on developers for TCP/IP now. You're just relying on Google and Apple and Mozilla developers that they are not just defrauding you from the real HTTP or the real TCP/IP, but you are not just trusting continuous upgrades. So a Bitcoin where the fundamental layer, the economical layer, which is taking care of the monetary policy, for example, is ossified enough, that kind of Bitcoin will be way more leaderless and way more trustless than Bitcoin now, which is in turn way more leaderless and trustless than Bitcoin 2009, which was in turn way more leaderless and trusted than e-gold in 2005, which was in turn way more leaderless and trustless than fiat system before e-gold, which was in turn, way worse than physical gold before. But the problem with physical gold is that everybody was happy, but you could not move that across continents. It was super heavy to transport, and not divisible enough. So that was the reason representative money was invented in the first place. So I think it's not a fake, it's not a false argument. It's a completely void argument. It's a very captious, it's I think it's intellectually dishonest argument. Of course, you have to challenge I mean, this strawman is not just used by people like Derose in order to now criticize Bitcoin because it doesn't feel relevant anymore. It's also used by some Bitcoiners in good faith because they really think that that's literally true. And you have to tell people, it's correct to tell people that trust doesn't mean that everything. Even if everybody is able to build Bitcoin Core from source with a deterministic build and check it against everything else, still people will use hardware, which is maybe ARM or Intel with some backdoors and so. I mean, nothing is ever leaderless. A trust mechanism, as long as we have division of labor, you will have to trust somebody else. And when you don't, you will have to trust your own memory and to assess the level of trust in your own memory, because maybe you're just getting senile and you're forgetting things. So it's completely void. The absolute trustlessness is just a crazy, inexistent meme, and nobody with any understanding of Bitcoin really seriously promotes that kind of imaginary trustlessness and leaderlessness. Of course, there are developers. Of course, there are market makers. Of course, there are educators. Of course, there are just a cultural phenomenon. The point is that the actual information you are carrying when you're saying this is leaderless is how difficult it is to change it or to own it, as compared to other contextual reference examples like fiat money. Of course, it's not. I mean, rock and roll was a leader. I mean, Arab Springs were a leaderless phenomenon. Of course, there were a lot of leaders there. Rock and roll was a leaderless. There was not. I mean, yeah, Elvis was the king, but there was not a leader of rock and roll. Still, there were a lot of leaders of rock and roll. People starting it, people spreading it, people changing it. But the point is that you cannot have a political decision to change the nature of rock and roll because it's not a heavily centralized system. It is a fairly decentralized culture, so you cannot really change it. We can name any kind of leaderless social phenomenon was actually not literally leaderless, of course.
No, I agree, and if you look at, or I agree with the way that you frame that, in that, with you mentioned gold being leaderless, and I think that, in a way, I guess you could call it, the leader of gold in a way is just history. They've been established for so long that there's no need to have that, and as you stated, there's less leaders over time as Bitcoin becomes more established, as there's fewer needs for changes, and especially ones that cause disagreements within the community of users. There will be fewer and fewer leaders of it, and that was an excellent way to frame it as far as for like rock and roll. And in that way, I just, when I see that concept of saying, well, Bitcoin has no leaders, I would say that I think that the UASF in a way was an example of that, because you had a group
Sure.
of leaders that were pushing forward with the 2x and the New York and Hong Kong agreements, and then you had a separate set of leaders who rallied their camps of people and engaged in that kind of intellectual sparring to come to the conclusion that they wanted. And I figure that you would have that nuanced opinion of it. It's just that I think it becomes, as Bitcoin goes on, it becomes more dangerous for these very blanket statements that are done in good faith, because you also can't try to pitch somebody Bitcoin and then spend 4 hours going into every nuanced version of trustlessness and no leaders and that sort of stuff, versus just a very um, easier to package kind of soundbite. But it is, I think that as it goes on, because in the same way, like, if you look at, you know with like children, right? I think that, to me, I've had this argument with my wife about things like Santa Claus and things like that. Is that my contention is that I think that it does breed a bit of distrust in your parents, where if you tell them something is true for a really long time, and then they find out that it's absolutely not. There's no tooth fairy. There's no Santa Claus. It's just your parents that are taking your tooth and leaving you a buck. That if there's a level of distrust, subconsciously perhaps, that develops in people when you give them the sound bites of Bitcoin, but then they find out that, yeah, there's a lot more nuance to what we're saying, and that could just be me getting way too down into the weeds of things. But that was kind of where my thought process was coming from.
Well, but not just like there are like white lies and like kid legends, which I mean it's fine. I mean, my grandfather, when I was a kid, used to tell me about his war history in World War II, and they were completely made up. And my mother knew that they were obviously made up, and I understood it as long as I came of the age of 6, probably because they were clearly absurd. But they were. I mean, it was not the reason. But even if you don't go to, I mean, Bitcoin is fungible or Bitcoin is leaderless. They are not even that. They are just common sense, actual natural language uses. Every kind of, if you use the natural language, you cannot be strictly literal. Of course, you always assume the context of the conversation. If I tell somebody Bitcoin is leaderless, I don't actually mean it's more leaderless than physical gold was. Or I assume it's orders of magnitude more decentralized than the alternative we are discussing, which is centralized fiat system, or than any previous experiment in this direction. But that's, I mean, I think that anybody, if you don't try very hard to find some kind of strawman argument in order to debate for some reasons, I think that everybody can really understand that's common sense. If we don't use formal language, if we use natural language, everything we say is mostly contextual, up to a reasonable degree, of course. You can be willingly ambiguous, but even when you're very clear, what you're saying cannot be literally true in any context. That's literally true for everything. I mean, even when people say like about Bitcoin maximalism, we discussed this in the previous interview. I say everything which is not Bitcoin is a scam. Oh my God, this is not literally true because they may be, so this cannot be a literal rule because they may be something that you don't know in the future. Sure, I know, but this is a sentence just the same as when cryptographers say you don't roll out your own crypto. Of course, that's a rule in cryptography, right? You don't roll out your own crypto. That's like a golden rule. Of course, you do roll out your own crypto. Otherwise, Shore and Merkel and everybody, they couldn't, and Chaum, nobody would have rolled out their own crypto if this rule was true. But you have to contextualize in the context of cryptography. It's a very, very serious red flag when you are rolling out your own cryptography, I mean, without any need. Same goes for so I tell you, if you receive an email from a Nigerian prince, that's a scam. In Nigeria, you have this kind of clans where there can be a chief with a son, and he will be a prince, and maybe this guy is actually a good guy, and he can send email to people, and they will not be literally a scam because Nigerian princes can be legit sometimes, but it's so irrelevant in the context you are discussing that I think that only in bad faith you can use the nuances of natural languages in order to argue that then you cannot apply the simple heuristic when you're talking with a lot of people in a very short time and you're selling, look, people, I'm a security expert. Nigerian princes are scams. They are not really giving you money. Then I know that somebody is actually in business with a legit Nigerian prince, which is an honest guy, but it's just not the norm. Something will do enlarge your penis, but mostly not. So don't open that email and don't open that attachment because it's a scam. It's just the context thinking, which is normal. And I may add, in your example, it's even more clear because you said during the UASF, there were two camps, like the New York Agreement pushing for the New York broken implementation, BTC1, and there were other people other leaders pushing against that. But that's not even the whole story. There were at least three camps. There were the market leaders pushing for New York agreements, like exchanges and like New York people. Then there were the ASICs leader, Bitmain, pushing for the miner activated hard fork, which was something that later became Bitcoin Cash. Then there were the software leaders in Bitcoin Core, not pushing for UASF, and actually most of them pushing against BIP 148. The majority of them, Bitcoin Core did not merge BIP 148 until after it was already until after BIP 191 was already locked in. So Core was formally, by any possible metric, the informal decentralized group of developers was overall against UASF. In the way it was implemented, at least, except for Luke and Schadenfrei and very few other people. What you get is basically at least three camps, and then you have the leader, like the leader of the USASF, which is Luke and Schadenfrei, one guy and one anonymous guy, and these leaders, they rushed a huge community of independent people that agree with them, and it changed the dynamics in the game theory. So I don't think you can find any kind of monetary phenomenon in the recent era after fiat, which is as decentralized and as leaderless as this. Of course, within the reasonable constraints of natural language, where leaderless doesn't really mean that you cannot see any leadership dynamic at all.
And the last question I wanted to ask you was, or actually, do you have time for one more question? I know we're hitting an hour right now.
Sure, sure, sure.
Um,
Yeah, no, I got
yeah,
it.
so I'd been doing quite a few episodes as of late about the topic of the Bitcoin religion, which you announced as a fact at the Value of Bitcoin conference panel, I believe, this last year. I think it was in the summer. I'm not quite sure the exact month, but um,
Yeah, late spring or summer.
yeah,
Yeah.
so I mean, I don't know how much you've heard all those episodes. I've had ones where I've talked about it. I've talked to Vin about this. I've had Gigi on as well to talk about these sorts of things. But how do you personally view it as a religion? What makes it one in your opinion? Why do you think it has become this versus just an open source tech project?
Yeah, so well, there are at least three layers in which you can tell this, in which you can state this claim, this sentence, and usually it's just useless to specify which one you're using because it's clear again from the context. There is an absolute literal layers if you are talking with a scholar of religions that is defining religions in a very strict way with some strict specification. Then of course Bitcoin is not a religion, and probably even some things that people call religions like Buddhism, maybe they're not religion, or maybe yes. So of course there is super literal specific technical term, and then there is just the simplified discussion term which we may use in order to get some insight and some kind of understanding of the global phenomenon with using more liberally the terms. And also you have the other side of the spectrum, which is an explicitly provocatory way to, I mean, a use of the term which is even willingly paradoxical and very aggressive, because you know that it's very borderline, but you also think it's still insightful, and it can be provocative of interesting understanding and interesting thoughts. So you use that even if you know that it's very far stretch and it's very very aggressive, let's say. And probably the way I use Bitcoin as a religion is more toward between the second and the third way of using the word. Of course, I like to use this kind of sentence, especially when I think it will be highly triggering for people. So I abuse this sentence in a way that is clear from the context I am abusing it. But also a little bit, I think that in a non-super academic way, it's actually true. I mean, Bitcoin is a social phenomenon, and it is a special subset of social phenomenon which has both some shallow and funny resemblances of religions. Like we have a holy book, like many religions, which is like the white paper, and you have some people who is like if you think about Christianity, you have the Catholic Church, which is not really based on the book. It's based on the thought tradition of Catholic Church. So it's like a tradition which is actually embodied in a very complex social phenomenon called the doctrine of the Church. And the book is not something that you get to take literal. And then when Protestantism came upon in Europe, starting from German Protestantism and Lutheranism, after that, many Protestant churches, they started to actually be like to come back to the text. They were basically more literal. They said the Catholic Church is not really doing what the literal text of the gospel is saying, or even the ancient testament of the Bible is saying. So you can have like the Amish, Anabaptists, a lot of people trying to some evangelical churches. We have to go back to the literal text against this kind of more complex social phenomenon. This is very similar, if you want, to what happened with some shitcoins. Like I mean, yeah, Bitcoin is like Bitcoin rules are encoded in the software, but we only care for the literal description inside the white paper, which is the holy text. And so we want to get back to the holy text. And so it's like these shitcoins are actually like Protestant schisms from because they are more literal than the very complex, difficult to grasp social evolution of the actual Bitcoin rule. I mean, the Bitcoin white paper doesn't even include the 21 million units limit. It doesn't include a lot of stuff that in the code are there. So your Bitcoin node is validating a set of rules which are not entirely derived from the white paper. In some cases, they even contradict the white paper since the times of Satoshi, like longest chain as opposed to heaviest chain and so on, or SPV with fraud proofs. So Satoshi himself evolved from the literal text. So you have this is just an example, but you have a lot of other example of things that look funny things that in the surface they look like religious phenomenons. Of course, in the field of BSV, you have the literal like deification of the Frauster founder Craig Wright. Some people was literally saying that he was the second coming of Jesus and something like that. And there is a very religious sect like phenomenon. And in general, like I talk with people, intelligent people, not easily suggestible people that are. I mean, some of us are changing their lives so much because of Bitcoin, intellectually, practically, financially, professionally, technically. That is something that is very similar to what happens to people when you have like a born again Christians and stuff like that. It's something that is changing. Of course, there are also deeper ways in which Bitcoin is the overall Bitcoin phenomenon. Of course, Bitcoin is just a word. The word Bitcoin overlaps with can be used to label different things as many words. You have like polysemitism. You have different meanings under this word. One is the unit of 100 millions of satoshis. Then you have the idea of Satoshi Nakamoto how to create a decentralized anti-double spend, double spend safe digital cash system. Then you have the actual first implementation called Bitcoin. Then you have the Bitcoin culture, the Bitcoin phenomenon, the Bitcoin, let's call it community, even if it's of course a network of very different communities, which are completely different across each other. So you have a very complex set of intricate network of phenomena, all called Bitcoin. Of course, if you take this last very, very wide meaning of Bitcoin, that's even deeply similar in some cases, which are not academically strict, to a religion. You have you have a deep change in the personal life. You have like it's not people don't really. I mean, I will not give up my 9 to 5 job as I did in 2014. I will not change my life completely. I will not change most of the things of my life for an open source project, just for that, or for a financial investment. You do your life, you do a financial investment. If it's good, you get rich. You can buy Google shares at the beginning and you become rich, but it didn't really change it your life. You can work, you can do a pull request in Linux kernel. I mean, Linux is closer to a religion than Google shares for sure, but still, you can do a contribution to I don't know, BitTorrent, and okay, you just made a contribution to BitTorrent, just open source development. Bitcoin is different. There is a strength, a cultural strength in the narrative around the origins. I mean, you have a goal which is highly. It is not metaphysical. It is not existential. It's more. It's more concrete. It's more probably, let's say, heartly. It's something we want on this earth. It's just about justice and freedom on this earth. So it's not something about afterlife, of sure, but it's something strong with very strong idealistic parts and sides. And he has a lot of. So religion can be. I think that religion can be seen as the overlap between some kind of deep, life-changing meaning, plus a lot of very, very codified and particular social encoding of rituals, basically. And Bitcoin not only has a very strong fundamental appeal to high ideals and life changing goals, but it also has a lot of rituals. Like we have, it's still young, of course, but I mean, again with the example of rock and roll, many rock and roll fans will tell you, tongue in cheek, not really, half jokingly, rock and roll is a religion. It is a joke, but not really so. And with Bitcoin is even more so. So it's a tongue in cheek sentence, which is half serious and half not. But the parts that are serious are actually useful to understand some of the aspects of it.
Yeah, it's been said, one of the episodes I was talking about is that evolutionary psychologists have thought that the development of religion amongst early peoples was a necessary evolutionary stage as far as for binding together groups of people at a deeper level than just mere survival. Right? You form into tribes. Mostly just so that you can have a much safer existence. You can get access to not just better security, but better ability to gather food or something if you're injured, that sort of stuff. And that, my thought with Bitcoin is that, Gigi did a great write up on where he talks about Bitcoin as an organism, and that this organism itself is possibly evolution just takes place between mutations, and some of them are successful, some of them are not. The ones that aren't successful don't survive, and the ones that do, and this could be just another evolutionary aspect of that, I guess, if you want to call it that Bitcoin organism. And that by creating this sort of these sort of conditions where people view it as that it binds the community together, and if that happens to work better, it's a better survival for Bitcoin, and then that'll just incentivize it for further development and down that road as binding the community together. Looking at this as not just, well, yeah, I like this app, but if it dies, like Vine or whatever, I'll just switch to something else. Whereas if you view it as something that's integral to your life, the thing itself will actually have a better chance of survival into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. That's yeah. It has some. I mean, rituals and memes definitely have an evolutionary role. So if it's not really biological, it's a little bit cultural, culturally speaking. So this doesn't mean that the meaning conveyed by some of these memes is not true. I mean, the fact that he had an evolutionary role doesn't mean that it's automatically false. But it's true that it's not just about whether the meme is true or not. It's also about the function of the meme on the society. Of course, I would not justify spreading a fake meme, outright fake, just because it has a role. I think that's just a bad form of the. I mean, it's possible it happens, but I'm personally against that from an ethical and professional point of view. But for sure, along with the truth or not of the meaning, there is the functional social role of memes. I mean, memes in the original meaning, not just the funny Twitter gifs, but even the funny Twitter gifs. I mean, we live in a timeline where Pepe's memes and Kekistan memes deeply influenced political elections. I mean, we live in a great meme epoch, so meme era. So that's very strong. And of course, in the case of religion, some of these rituals are about deep life-changing meaning, and some are more superficial and even more like folkloristic. And you can think about, for example, the anonymous founder disappearing, Satoshi. That's useful because it was. I mean, the OPSEC of Satoshi was fundamental, so it's not just a meme. It was actually necessary probably to bootstrap Bitcoin. So he had to do that way. But it also makes for a great story. I mean, an unprecedented story. Tell me a story which is more, it is more interesting than the origin story of Bitcoin in the last centuries. I think you can't if you talk objectively, if you understand what you're talking about. And of course, it's a matter of taste, but I think it's a great story. And like many religions, Bitcoin has foundation myths, but these foundation myths, they also are actually true. So that's even better.
Well, I appreciate your time. I had a few more questions, but I don't want to keep you. I know it's already late there, so I really appreciate.
If you want to go until 1 hour 30, we can go other 10 minutes. Then I
Yeah,
have to.
well, I think the direction I was going to go was going to be a little bit longer than 10, 15 minutes. So we'll just save that. I'll save these for the next time I bring you on, and we'll get a little bit better
Sure.
context as time goes on too for those questions. But I really, I appreciated having you on. And how can people find you, consume your content and just see what you're up to?
So far, I'm still completely centralized and censorship prone and fragile because I'm just basically moving on Twitter, or I'm either parasiting other people's websites. Like my seminars are either on Bcademy, BCADA. Well, like Academy, what would be .it, and you can find some seminars there. Some on the Tone Base website, you can find my seminar for February in Las Vegas, running Bitcoin. So my professional stuff is a little bit all around, and my only unified stream is right now Twitter. So if Jack Dorsey decides to ban me, I'm finished from a social point of view. So I'm still thinking that I know that I have to have a website, and I hope that by the next interview with you, I will send people to giacomozucco.com. But I'm super lazy, and I want to do it good with GitHub pages and Jekyll, and I'm so lazy, and I'm busy with stuff, so I never do it. But right now, Giacomo Zucco on Twitter is the only centralized point of failure.
Well, thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Sure, my pleasure.